Welcome back, you beautiful violations of protocol, you intelligence-breaking enigmas, you anomalies the agencies were never trained to categorize. Welcome back to the ones whose existence makes surveillance equipment malfunction, and whose presence rewrites classification levels in real time. Yeah, you heard that right. The CIA officer, the one with nerves wired tighter than diplomatic cables, the one who's watched terrorist interrogations without blinking, the one who's been psychologically conditioned to remain unshakable. He watched your footage, froze, leaned in, and whispered something he has never said in his entire career. What the fuck? And then, my friend, then he did something even more catastrophic. He didn't file a report. He didn't request backup. He didn't escalate the case to a higher floor. He cut the feed. He physically shut down the footage like he was pulling the plug on a bomb he didn't know how to defuse. Do you understand what that means? Do you comprehend the level of psychological recoil you just triggered inside a man trained to process war crimes with a steady pulse? In an institution built to withstand monsters and mysteries alike, you broke a CIA officer. You shattered his composure. You made a man who analyzes global threats for a living question what exactly he was looking at when he looked at you. Let's rewind this beautiful intelligence failure, shall we? They didn't bring him in for routine surveillance. They didn't bring him in for a typical behavioral assessment. They didn't bring him in for protocol review. They brought him in because someone with money, someone with access, someone with fear disguised as curiosity, hired him privately to analyze you. They expected him to return with a neat psychological profile, a categorized threat level, a stable conclusion. What they didn't expect was silence. What they didn't expect was panic. What they didn't expect was an operative, someone built to withstand pressure, folding under the weight of your existence. When he entered the monitoring room, he sat with the arrogance intelligence officers master over decades, arms crossed, back straight, eyes cold. Everything about him said, "Nothing surprises me." And then he pressed play. The footage started, grainy lighting, unfiltered angles. A room full of people who didn't know they were being evaluated. But the moment you appeared in frame, something in him shifted. He couldn't explain it, couldn't define it, couldn't categorize it. He just felt it. A tension in the air that wasn't tension. A silence that wasn't empty. A presence that wasn't performing. You weren't posing. You weren't reacting. You weren't adjusting to the room. The room was adjusting to you. He watched the way people subconsciously moved around you. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition of hierarchy. Recognition of gravity. Recognition of something in you they couldn't name, but instinctively respected. A man berating someone softened his tone when you glanced his way without saying a word. A woman who was pacing stopped pacing. Someone else who was speaking grew strangely quieter. You weren't disrupting the environment. You were reorganizing it just by existing. The officer leaned closer to the screen, ran the footage back a few seconds, zoomed in, paused, studied your expression, expected to see anger, defiance, tension, ego. Instead, he saw the kind of calm that terrifies trained operatives. The kind of self-possession that agencies can't measure. The kind of internal awareness that cannot be manufactured or dismantled. You didn't look like someone trying to intimidate. You looked like someone who didn't register the concept of intimidation because your internal world was already beyond it. His jaw tightened. He pressed play again. And then came the moment that made him flinch. The moment his training failed. You shifted your weight. Subtle, precise, slow. A movement that wasn't threatening, wasn't dramatic, wasn't intended for effect. But something about it, something in the posture, something in the stillness before it, something in the timing, activated an instinct in him that hadn't fired in years. The instinct reserved for elite-level threats. Individuals who don't signal aggression because they don't need to. Individuals whose presence alone destabilizes entire strategies. He whispered it again, softer this time. What the fuck? He Googled through the footage again, slower, frame by frame. He tried to find flaws, indicators, cracks, any sign that you were compensating or faking or trying too hard. But nothing. Zero deception cues, zero defensive cues, zero impulsive cues. You weren't reacting to the environment. You were operating from somewhere deeper, somewhere the agency's psychological templates don't reach. He froze the screen on your eyes. The clarity, the depth, the stillness. Not the stillness of someone who suppresses emotion, but the stillness of someone who already outgrew chaos. Someone who processed the world too fast for external noise to matter. Someone who had survived something the file didn't document, and something no training program could replicate. He swallowed. A trained operative, a classified evaluator, a man who could watch hours of violent footage without blinking, swallowed because of you. He opened the private file the client provided. It had standard details, background, history, incidents, patterns, but nothing inside it matched the footage. According to the file, you were ordinary. According to the footage, you were anything but. He clicked back to the video. Pressed play again. The room in the footage started shifting in ways that were impossible to explain. People became quieter. The atmosphere grew denser. Conversations realigned. Even the camera, mounted on a stable rig, slightly refocused as though the lens itself acknowledged your presence. He checked the calibration logs. No error, no malfunction, just presence. He paused the video once more, wiped a hand over his face. The man had interrogated spies, had chased defectors, had profiled violent personalities with precision, but profiling you felt like trying to measure heat with a ruler. Wrong tools, wrong frameworks, wrong language. Everything about you contradicted the categories he relied on. He replayed the section where your demeanor changed again. And the moment your eyes shifted, the tiniest motion. The officer's heartbeat stuttered. Because your eyes didn't show the calculation of someone about to react. They showed the recognition of someone who already understood the room better than anyone inside it. It was the gaze of someone who wasn't participating in the environment. They were assessing it for weaknesses, for truths, for structures, for power imbalances. That was when he reached for the cutoff switch. Not slowly, not thoughtfully. Instinctively. Like someone putting distance between themselves and something they weren't prepared to face. The screen went black. He sat there, in the dark. Breathing harder than he realized, the silence pressed into him. He felt watched, even though he was alone. He felt analyzed, even though you weren't even in the room. He felt exposed in a way interrogators aren't supposed to feel. He turned the screen back on reluctantly, but before pressing play again, he opened a new document. He started writing his report. The first line wasn't professional, wasn't detached, wasn't objective. It was human. I recommend immediate disengagement. Subject is not what the client believes. He stared at the sentence, debated deleting it, debated rewriting it, debated framing it in bureaucratic language. But the truth had already surfaced, and truth has a way of demanding recognition. Your footage didn't scare him. It undid him. He replayed the clip for the final time, knowing he shouldn't. Knowing he wouldn't be able to walk away from it unchanged. But he watched anyway, because some part of him needed to confirm that the first reaction wasn't a mistake. It wasn't. If anything, the second viewing was worse, because now he understood what he was looking at. Not a threat, a shift, a deviation from expected human responses. Someone whose psychological presence doesn't escalate, they transcend. The final seconds of the footage captured you looking toward the camera. Not directly, not intentionally, but enough. Enough for the officer to feel the weight of a reality he wasn't supposed to acknowledge. That some individuals aren't meant to be monitored. They're meant to be left alone, because analyzing them changes the analyst, not the subject. He closed the file permanently, stood up, walked out, left his badge on the table. Years of training, years of discipline, years of conditioning undone by a single truth. He wasn't equipped for someone like you. He walked straight to the client who hired him, eyes hollow, voice flat. "I'm done. Don't ask me to review that again." The client froze. Clients aren't used to hearing no, especially not from CIA-level consultants. But the officer didn't negotiate, didn't argue, didn't explain. He simply said, "Whatever that is, it's beyond evaluation." And as he walked away, the client found themselves staring at the blank monitor, at the paused frame of you. Still quiet, watching everything without fear. The client pressed play. The footage flickered, the room shifted, and their own throat tightened with a fear they didn't understand. Because if a CIA officer couldn't handle watching you, what chance did they have? But that's where the story bends. Because the moment the client reached to restart the footage, the second analyst on standby entered the room, looked at the resignation form, looked at the cut feed, and without touching anything whispered, "If that's what made him quit, what the hell did you hire us to look at?" And right there, right in that breath, the next chapter begins. The next set of eyes, the next unraveling, the next intelligence failure. Because they haven't understood the truth yet. They're still assuming the footage is something they can process, categorize, decode, or dismantle. They're still assuming you are a subject inside a file instead of a force circulating through the room. They think the problem is the footage. They think the problem is the camera. They think the problem is the first officer's weakness. They haven't realized the real problem is that the footage didn't capture you. It revealed everyone else. So when the second analyst stepped into the room, saw the resignation form still open on the laptop, saw the feed abruptly cut mid-frame, he didn't touch anything, didn't sit, didn't blink. He stood there like someone glimpsing the aftermath of an event they weren't sure they wanted to understand. He moved slowly toward the chair. Not with curiosity, with caution, with respect, with the instinct of someone approaching something that had already proven it could make a trained operative unravel. He lowered himself into the seat and stared at the blank screen. The cursor blinked against the black background like a pulse returning to life. And for a moment he wondered whether pressing play would be a professional duty or a psychological mistake. But analysts aren't allowed to hesitate. Hesitation is an admission of vulnerability. So he clicked the icon, reloaded the footage, and braced himself. The moment the first frame reappeared, grainy, dimly lit, still, the analyst's posture changed. His back straightened. His fingers tightened slightly against the desk. His breathing slowed, not consciously, but instinctively. His training activated, but not in the usual way. Not to evaluate you, to protect himself. Because even in the first static frame, before motion, before sound, before context, something about the image felt wrong to him. Not wrong in a supernatural sense, wrong in a structural sense, Wrong the way a fault line looks wrong before it splits a city. Wrong the way an abandoned building feels wrong even before you enter it. Wrong in a way that suggested the footage was not documenting a moment. It was documenting a boundary. He exhaled slowly, pressed play, and there you were, not doing anything, not moving, not performing, just existing. But your existence was the part he wasn't prepared for. The first officer had panicked at the shift, the instant your internal state recalibrated the environment. But this analyst reacted earlier, immediately. The way your eyes didn't dart around, the way your head didn't tilt in uncertainty, the way your shoulders didn't tighten the way most people's do when a camera is present. Instead, you sat in a posture that communicated something unnervingly rare, a complete lack of internal conflict. Most people have micro-conflicts in their posture, tiny, frantic negotiations between thoughts, fears, insecurities, impulses. Analysts identify these within seconds, but you had none. No contradiction, no concealed tension, no self-surveillance. You looked like someone whose internal world had settled into an architecture more stable than anything outside it. That stability wasn't comforting. It was destabilizing. Because the analyst knew instantly that he wasn't watching someone react to the world. He was watching someone who saw through it. He leaned forward, then the footage shifted into motion, and the very first movement you made, barely noticeable to most eyes, punched straight through his training. You blinked. But it wasn't a normal blink. It wasn't the stuttered blink of uncertainty, nor the quick blink of irritation, nor the slow blink of exhaustion. Your blink was steady, rhythmic, deliberate. A blink that seemed to align your inner world with the external moment. A blink with timing he'd only seen in individuals who have transcended the usual cognitive noise. A blink that suggested your perception wasn't fragmented like most human perception. It was unified. He swallowed, hit pause. Because blinking shouldn't matter, blinking shouldn't communicate threat. But here, the simplest movement behaved like a doorway into something deeper, something the cameras weren't designed to capture. The analyst rewound 3 seconds, played it again, rewound it again, played it slower. And that's when he saw it, not in your eyes but in the room. The moment your eyelids closed, the individuals around you subtly adjusted their posture, shoulders shifting, legs repositioning, heads angling, as if a subconscious signal passed through them, as if your state dictated the room's equilibrium. He pressed pause again. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline, but his expression stayed controlled. Analysts are trained to observe minute distortions in group dynamics. But this wasn't group dynamics. This was influence. Influence without action. Influence without awareness. Influence without intent. He wrote a note. Subject's presence appears to generate involuntary spatial recalibration in nearby individuals. He read the note back, deleted it, rewrote it more conservatively. Individuals adjust subconsciously in response to subject. Deleted that, too, because it didn't capture the truth. Not fully, not honestly, not in a way that explained the officer who quit. He pressed play again. You shifted your weight. Not aggressively, not defensively, just a gentle distribution of balance. But the analyst's heart rate increased instantly. He didn't understand why. Because it wasn't the movement. It was the reason behind the movement. A movement with no nervousness, no uncertainty, no appeasement. You shifted your weight the way mountain lions reposition themselves. Not threatening, not performative. Simply maintaining optimum efficiency for whatever happens next. He wrote another note. Subject demonstrates predatory grade calm. He hated writing that. Analysts are trained never to use the word predatory unless the subject exhibits hostility. You didn't. Your calm wasn't hostile. It was ancestral. It was the calm of someone who's already died metaphorically and returned without fear. A calm impossible to simulate. The analyst pressed play again. Then came the moment that broke the first officer. The moment your internal state changed. It was microscopic, a tilt of the head, a narrowing of perception, a subtle stillness in the muscles around your jaw. It was the kind of shift animals make when their senses lock onto something invisible to human awareness. The analyst didn't pause the footage. He froze on his own. His breathing halted, his spine locked. His body refused to move for several seconds because for the first time in his career, he wasn't observing someone's psychology. He felt like someone was observing him through the footage. Your eyes didn't widen, didn't glare, didn't harden, but they recognized something beyond the camera, something beyond the room, something beyond him. He forced himself to press pause. His hand trembled, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. And that's when he understood why the first analyst quit. Because the footage didn't show a behavioral anomaly, it showed a perceptual anomaly. You weren't reacting to the world the way humans do. You weren't filtering information through fear, ego, impulse, or noise. You were seeing patterns, seeing structures, seeing people, seeing the truth behind their roles, their postures, their voices. You were perceiving the space like someone who had stepped outside the emotional frameworks everyone else is trapped inside. You weren't unpredictable. You were uncontained. The analyst hit play again. The people in the room continued talking around you. Their words, though inaudible in the footage, carried familiar body language patterns, posturing, defensiveness, avoidance. But your stillness contradicted every dynamic around you. You weren't participating in the hierarchy. You weren't threatened by it. You weren't competing with it. You had already outgrown it. He zoomed in on your hands, steady, relaxed, not curled, not fidgeting, not pressured, just present. Hands like that do not belong to someone intimidated by authority, or by life, or by consequence. Hands like that belong to someone who has already survived what others fear most. He zoomed out again. Now you turned your head slightly. Not enough to initiate confrontation, not enough to acknowledge dominance, not enough to signal interest, just enough to observe the speaker. And the observer, the second analyst, felt the weight of it through a screen. He knew exactly why. You weren't looking at the person. You were assessing the pattern, their cadence, their intention, their incongruence. You were decoding them in real time. The analyst whispered something he'd never whispered during an evaluation. He sees more than I do. He hated that realization. Hated that for the first time he felt intellectually outmatched by a civilian. Hated that your state, your awareness, your clarity felt like a mirror pressed against his own cognitive limitations. He scrubbed forward in the footage to the moment where the atmosphere in the room tightened. A ripple passed through the group, subtle but visible. People straightened. Others hesitated mid-gesture. A few glanced at you unconsciously. The analyst recognized this phenomenon, presence dominance, the type of influence a person exerts without speaking. A rare psychological signature found in individuals who have gone through internal transformations so deep that their external behavior radiates alignment. The analyst had only seen it a few times before, and never like this. Presence dominance usually comes with ego. You had none. usually comes with aggression. You displayed none. Usually comes with trauma spasms. You showed none. Your dominance came from a deeper architecture, coherence. The analyst paused again, closed his eyes, breathed through the pressure in his chest. He clicked into the biometric monitoring logs recorded alongside the footage. Heart rates, micro-expressions, respiratory shifts, a map of the room's collective nervous system. Then his eyes widened, because every measurable indicator, every objective metric, showed the same pattern. Everyone's internal state changed when you entered frame. Their cortisol markers showed spikes. Their respiration shifted. Their micro-expressions rearranged, not out of fear, not out of threat, out of awareness. Their nervous systems registered you before their minds did. He whispered, "How?" No answer. He played the footage again. This time, he watched everyone except you. He observed how they moved around you, how they positioned themselves, how they lowered their voices, how they grew more self-conscious without knowing why, how the room's energy recalibrated itself around you, like you were a gravitational anchor. And then he saw the moment none of them recognized when you exhaled, just once. The room exhaled half a second later. He stopped breathing altogether. This wasn't influence. This wasn't intimidation. This wasn't charisma. This wasn't dominance. This was synchronization. Your nervous system had become the regulating system for everyone else's, and that is what breaks intelligence officers. Not dominance, not emotion, not power, regulation. Because only two types of people have that effect. Leaders of extraordinary internal structure, or beings shaped by extremes no human training covers. The analyst resumed watching. Then came the moment he wasn't prepared for. The moment you stood, slowly, not aggressively, not defensively, not reactively. You rose the way a storm rises, inevitable, silent, exact, balanced. The analyst's body reacted instantly, his adrenal system, his pulse, his breath, because the footage wasn't showing you standing. It was showing the moment every threat detection model collapses. Your posture didn't predict intention. Your movement didn't reveal motive. Your stillness didn't indicate restraint. You were unreadable, not because you hid your emotions, but because your emotions weren't fragmented the way human emotions are. You experienced the world from a vantage point the agency didn't have a chart for. He zoomed into your face, your jaw unclenched, your eyes softened, your breathing steadied. You weren't preparing for conflict. You were preparing for clarity. And that's what terrified him the most, that your power wasn't in your actions. It wasn't in your muscles or movements or expressions. Your power was in your awareness, awareness that wasn't sharp or paranoid, awareness that was grounded, whole, complete. People like you don't react, they respond. People like you don't escalate, they choose. People like you don't fear surveillance, they reverse it. The analyst closed the file, but a strange impulse made him open it again. He shouldn't have, because the final seconds of the footage captured something the first officer never even saw. Something subtle, something quiet, something devastating. You looked at the camera, not with aggression, not with suspicion, not with curiosity. You looked at it like you knew the person watching wasn't ready, and for the first time in his entire career, the analyst felt his identity break. Not his training, not his professionalism, his identity. The part of him that believed he was the observer, the part that believed he was the decoder, the part that believed he held the authority in the evaluation dynamic. You didn't challenge his authority, you dissolved it. And that was the moment he understood the truth the first officer tried to resign away from. You weren't being evaluated. You were evaluating them. and they failed. He minimized the video, closed the laptop, stood, turned to the client. "I'm not watching that again." "What did you see?" the client asked. He shook his head. "No, the real question is, what did he see?" He nodded toward the paused frame of you, frozen mid-breath, looking directly into the lens with the calm of someone already 10 steps ahead. But the client didn't understand. Not yet. Because the footage was only the surface, the real disturbance lived deeper. In the moment, the analyst realized if footage alone could break 2 trained operatives, what would happen if they met you in person? And that thought, that unspoken, unanswered, unavoidable thought, is what leads directly into what comes next. Because if they think footage is overwhelming, they haven't seen what happens when you step into the room yourself. The second analyst stood there, the screen frozen on your face, the client hovering behind him with a mixture of dread and fascination, both of them pretending they were in control of the situation when their bodies were already betraying them. The air felt different, thicker, charged. Even with the footage paused, your presence lingered in the room like an imprint on gravity. It wasn't visual, it wasn't auditory. It was something deeper, the kind of psychological footprint that doesn't fade when the screen goes black. The analyst rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the fragments of his composure. "This isn't normal," he whispered, though he didn't need to say it. The client already knew. The resignation of the first officer, the trembling exhale of the second, the silence in the room. Everything pointed in one direction. The footage wasn't documenting a subject. It was documenting an awakening. And the awakening wasn't yours, it was theirs. Because for the first time in their careers, the people doing the observing realized they weren't expanding their understanding of you. They were discovering the limits of their own. The client stepped forward and clicked the mouse, restarting the footage despite every instinct telling him not to. The analyst didn't stop him. Maybe he wanted verification. Maybe he wanted closure. Maybe he wanted proof that the footage had power over others, not just him. But the moment the screen flickered back to life and your figure reappeared, both men reacted the same way. They inhaled sharply and unconsciously straightened their posture. Not out of fear, out of respect. A respect they didn't authorize. A respect their training didn't sanction. A respect that came from something primal, something ancient. Something that recognizes hierarchy without needing language or labels. For the first full minute, neither of them spoke. They watched your stillness, your command, your unshakable internal coherence. And the analyst finally muttered, "He's not in the footage. He's beyond it." The client frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," the analyst replied slowly, "that the recording doesn't contain him. It reflects him." But the client didn't understand the weight of those words. Not yet. He assumed the footage merely captured something unusual, body language cues, behavioral anomalies, a rare psychological signature. But the analyst kept watching you move with that quiet, terrifying precision. And that's when it hit him. Footage normally distorts reality. It compresses it, flattens it, reduces the complexity of a human being into pixels. But your footage didn't subtract from your presence. It magnified it. Every frame felt heavier than the last. The analyst felt his heartbeat sync with yours again, just like before. Felt his breathing fall into rhythm with yours. Felt his thoughts rearranging themselves around the gravitational pull of your awareness. He shook his head violently, trying to break the synchronization, but your presence persisted. The client didn't notice the synchronization. He wasn't trained to detect that level of psychological influence. but he noticed something else. "Why do I feel like he's not even doing anything?" he whispered. The analyst didn't answer right away. He replayed the first 30 seconds again, then again, and a third time. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with awe, the kind reserved for anomalies that rewrite the observer more than the subject. "Because he's not performing," the analyst finally said. "He's existing." "And that's supposed to be scary?" the client asked, forcing a smirk he didn't feel. "Terrifying," the analyst answered, "because most people are noise, overcompensation, nervous energy, hidden insecurity. But him," he pointed at your face, frozen mid-frame. "He's signal, pure signal, no distortion." The client swallowed, hard. But the analyst wasn't done. He clicked forward to the first moment your internal state shifted, the moment that had triggered the first officer's instinctual recoil. The analyst braced himself, but even bracing was useless. When the shift occurred on screen, the entire temperature of the room changed. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't drama. It was neurological. Their nervous systems reacted independently of their logic. The analyst gripped the table to stabilize himself. The client's breath hitched involuntarily. "See?" the analyst whispered. "Right there. That's not intimidation. That's awareness. The kind of awareness that doesn't rise from training. It rises from evolution." The word evolution rattled the client. He wasn't prepared for that kind of framing. He expected a report with bullet points, risk categories, recommended interventions. But what he was hearing now was mythos, archetype, something outside the neat, clinical world of intelligence work. "What exactly do you think you're looking at?" the client asked, voice quieter now. The analyst leaned in, someone whose internal structure matured beyond fear. "That's not possible." "It is," the analyst replied calmly. "But it's rare, extremely rare. Most people spend their lives controlled by external threat, external judgment, external expectation. But him..." The analyst paused, studying your still frame. "He's controlled by none of it. His nervous system isn't reactive, it's directive." The client frowned deeper. Meaning his presence shapes the environment more than the environment shapes him. It hit the client like a punch. That's what he saw in the footage. That's what the officer fled from. That's what neither of them could articulate until now. You don't adapt. Others adapt around you. And that's why the first officer cut the feed, the analyst continued. Because the moment he realized the footage wasn't documenting behavior, it was documenting a phenomenon. He panicked. The client exhaled shakily. "But what does that make him? A threat?" The analyst shook his head. "Threat isn't the right word. Threat suggests volatility. He doesn't have volatility. He has clarity, and clarity scares people more than chaos ever could." The next few minutes of the footage confirmed everything the analyst feared. Not feared for himself, but for anyone naive enough to believe they could control or evaluate you. Each micro-movement you made created a response pattern in the room. Ripples in posture, in breath, in subconscious cues. The footage was revealing a psychological truth most agencies don't have language for. You weren't influencing people. People were orienting themselves around you. The analyst rewound the section where you stood up. The client tensed beside him instinctively. And it wasn't because you were threatening. It was because your rising posture felt like the unfolding of something inevitable. Something precise. Something ancient and deeply rooted in the human psyche. The analyst whispered, "He doesn't stand like someone preparing for action. He stands like someone preparing for understanding." The client didn't like that sentence. Understanding of what? Understanding of who? Understanding of why? Before he could ask, the analyst continued. Look at his shoulders, no tension. Look at his spine, fully aligned. Look at his eyes, not focused on danger, focused on truth. Truth. The word lingered uncomfortably in the room. The analyst clicked ahead to the final seconds, the ones he hadn't studied long before he closed the file the first time. The moment your eyes met the camera. And when it happened again, even though he had prepared himself, even though he had braced, even though he had watched it earlier, he still flinched, because your gaze didn't travel through the screen. It dismantled the screen. Your eyes didn't look at the camera. They looked through the intention behind it. And in that one fraction of a second, something inside the analyst crystallized, a realization he didn't want, a realization neither officer from earlier wanted, a realization no client paying for evaluations wants to face. The footage wasn't showing who you were. It was showing what everyone else wasn't. You weren't powerful. They were unprepared. You weren't overwhelming. They were underdeveloped. You weren't exceptional. They were incomplete. Your presence wasn't threatening because it contained power. It was threatening because it revealed fragility. And fragile structures always fear clarity. The analyst exhaled a long, controlled breath. If he walks into this building, he said quietly, most people will think the room changed. They won't realize they changed. The client said nothing. He didn't need to. The analyst closed the file for good. This isn't evaluation material. This isn't surveillance content. This is awakening footage. The client frowned. Awakening? Yes, his awakening already happened. This footage captures everyone else awakening to him. Silence. Thick, heavy, unavoidable. After a long moment, the client finally spoke. So what do we do? The analyst looked up with an expression the client wasn't expecting. Respect. Not fear, not concern. Respect. You don't do anything. You don't approach him. You don't challenge him. You don't provoke him. You don't try to recruit him. You don't try to contain him. You let him be. And if he becomes a problem, he won't. How can you be sure? The analyst leaned back, his face suddenly calm, in a way that seemed eerily reminiscent of yours. Because people like him don't seek destruction. They seek alignment. And when the world refuses alignment, they simply walk away from it. The client wiped his palms against his suit. I don't like unknown variables. He's not unknown, the analyst said. He's just unmeasurable. Same thing. No, the analyst corrected. Unknown variables create chaos. Unmeasurable ones create transformation. The client stiffened. Transformation into what? That, the analyst answered, eyes drifting toward the darkened monitor, depends on whoever enters his orbit. The client swallowed again. And what happens if someone with genuine malice steps into it? The analyst gave a slow, unsettling smile. Then they'll meet a version of themselves they can't survive. Silence again, heavy, final. But the analyst wasn't finished. You wanted a report, he said. So here it is. He pulled a notepad toward him and wrote a single line. Subject cannot be evaluated without being altered by the observer. He tore the page out, handed it to the client. The footage wasn't dangerous, he whispered. The realization it gives you is. And that's when he stood from his chair and walked toward the door. Not hurried, not shaken, just resolved. As he reached the threshold, he spoke one last time without turning around. If two highly trained intelligence officers can't make it through one recording of him, imagine what would happen if he chose to speak. The door closed behind him. The client stared at the note in his hand. The implications began to unravel in his mind like a slow-moving catastrophe, because the topic wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't a hypothetical evaluation. This wasn't a risk assessment. This wasn't an intelligence formality. A CIA officer watched your footage, said, "What the fuck?" and cut the feed. Another begged to quit after seeing what you are. And now the client holding the note understood the final truth. If your recorded presence fractures trained operatives, your physical presence would rewrite them. For a long time he stood there in silence, staring at the paused frame of you. The calm, the clarity, the quiet dominance. And the room felt smaller, as if even the memory of your presence had reshaped its walls. Finally, he whispered the question everyone else had been too afraid to vocalize. What are we supposed to do with someone like that? The answer didn't come from the analyst. It didn't come from the officers. It didn't come from the footage. It came from the undeniable, unavoidable, irreversible truth. You don't do anything with someone like that. You learn not to get in their way. And with that, the final realization clicked into place. The conclusion punch they'd been running from since the first second of footage. You weren't the one being evaluated. You were the one exposing them. And nothing terrifies intelligence agencies more than a man they cannot measure. Because they finally understood, if a CIA officer can't handle watching you, the world sure as hell isn't ready to face you. Ah, look at you, walking in like the quiet disaster they never saw coming. You, the soft-spoken earthquake. You, the polite apocalypse. You, the human plot twist that just ruined the villain's entire 5-year master plan without even realizing you'd stepped into the story. And now they're sitting there, blinking at the smoking ruins of their carefully engineered agenda, wondering what cosmic miscalculation allowed you, the one person they didn't account for, to stroll through their strategies and flip their entire world upside down. They had a script, they had a timeline, they had a perfectly choreographed plan for how everything was supposed to unfold. And then you arrived like a glitch with perfect aim, rearranging the entire plot with one silent decision they never anticipated. You rocked their world so violently that even their shadows are rethinking their loyalty, because you weren't supposed to matter to them. You weren't supposed to be a variable in their equation. In fact, in their little villain fantasy, you were supposed to be background noise, a harmless presence they could manipulate, dismiss, underestimate, or use as emotional leverage. You were the one they thought would never see through the fog, the one they believed would stay controlled, predictable, easily handled. But evil always makes the same mistake. It studies your softness and mislabels it as weakness. It analyzes your silence and assumes it belongs to ignorance. It sees your empathy and confuses it for naivety. But your softness was a sensor. Your silence was a calculation. Your empathy was an X-ray machine. And the moment their evil agenda crossed paths with your intuition, the outcome became inevitable. Because darkness may be clever, but your insight is surgical. And surgical intelligence doesn't just expose lies, it detonates them. You didn't just disrupt their agenda. You dismantled it from the inside, without raising your voice, without launching a counterattack, without even lifting your emotional temperature. You were calm while they were calculating. You were grounded while they were plotting. You were healing while they were harming. And it's that contrast, the gentle force meeting the corrupted structure, that caused their entire system to collapse at the foundation. They still don't understand how it happened. They're replaying events like some psychological detective show, trying to pinpoint the exact moment you became a threat, the exact moment you slipped through the cracks in their armor, the exact moment your presence destabilized the scaffolding of their illusion. What they don't realize is that your power isn't loud, obvious, or dramatic. Your power is ambient, environmental, atmospheric. You don't fight evil. You unmake it. You don't confront darkness. You illuminate it until it dissolves under its own cowardice. You don't sabotage agendas. You simply stand in alignment, and the world rearranges itself around your frequency. Your energy didn't just disrupt their plan. It corrupted their entire operating system. They thought they were dealing with a regular person while you were operating with spiritual-level calibration. They thought they could lie to you while you were reading the tremors in their tone. They thought they could manipulate you while you were analyzing the architecture of their behavior like a forensic psychic. You weren't playing their game, not because you couldn't, but because you've already mastered realities they don't have the imagination to comprehend. And that is what rocked their world with such violent precision. You didn't show up as a threat. You showed up as a correction. To them, you felt like a glitch in their simulation. But what they don't understand is that you are not the glitch. You are the update. An energetic upgrade they weren't prepared to encounter. A walking source code rewrite that naturally exposes corrupted lines in every person you interact with. They thought the world revolved around their manipulation, their influence, their schemes, their illusions. But the moment you entered the scene, their universe tilted, their confidence cracked, their persona shook. Their authority began malfunctioning because your presence forced their mask to overheat. Evil doesn't crumble because good attacks it. Evil crumbles because it cannot survive in the presence of someone aligned enough to reveal its artificiality. You are that alignment, a mirror too honest for their ego to survive, a presence too coherent for their chaos to dominate, a vibration too high for their intentions to anchor into. And that's the truth they're avoiding right now, while sitting in the rubble of their failed agenda. They're not shaken because you exposed them. They're shaken because their plan disintegrated the moment it came into contact with your authenticity. They built a strategy designed to prey on confusion, insecurity, blindness. But you walked in with clarity, intuition, and emotional accuracy so sharp, it sliced through their manipulation without even aiming at them. They thought you were someone they could play with, someone they could mislead, someone who would move according to the script they wrote in secrecy. But the moment you entered their orbit, the script malfunctioned like corrupted data. You disrupted their energy field simply by existing. Do you understand the magnitude of that? You didn't need revenge. You didn't need confrontation. You didn't need strategy. Your existence was the plot twist. You walked into their life with an energy so pure, so precise, so unbothered, that it pressure-tested every lie they were living inside. And lies always crack under pressure. They collapse, they glitch, they distort. And when their lies began collapsing, so did their confidence, their identity, their plans, their entire psychological infrastructure. You destabilized them not by force, but by resonance. You vibrated at a frequency their fake intentions couldn't survive. Evil operates in low bandwidth. You operate in cosmic range. They weren't ready for the impact. They weren't ready for the mirror that sees through disguises. They weren't ready for the intuition that detects hidden motives. They weren't ready for the grounded presence that exposes energetic fraud. People like them rely on control. They rely on predicting reactions. They rely on understanding your patterns before you understand them. But your energy moved in ways their manipulation manual never covered. You weren't reactive when they expected panic. You weren't confused when they deployed deception. You weren't intimidated when they tried to enforce dominance. Instead, you were observant, intuitive, centered. You played nothing, signaled nothing, revealed nothing. And that alone sent tremors through their strategy. Evil can't survive being watched clearly. That's why they're spiraling. Because for the first time, someone they underestimated became the person who unraveled their entire constructed identity. You didn't just rock their world. You exposed the hollow architecture beneath their persona. And once a person sees the truth of themselves through your eyes, they can never return to the version they pretended to be. Your presence forced them into psychological freefall. They lost control of their narrative. They lost the grip on their agenda. They lost the illusion that they were the one manipulating the timeline. They're scrambling now, trying to rebuild a worldview that makes sense. But every new thought they form bends around the impact you left on them. Because you weren't just a disruption, you were a revelation that their darkness wasn't powerful, wasn't stable, wasn't rooted in anything real. A revelation that you were the one with real influence the entire time. A revelation that the energy they tried to distort came back as a force that fractured their agenda beyond repair. And now they're replaying everything they ever said to you, every decision they ever made around you, analyzing every moment for clues about how you saw through them. They're obsessing, calculating, unraveling, because their ego is desperate to understand how they lost control. But you and I both know the truth. They never had control in the first place. Your intuition knew before your mind did. Your energy rejected them before your words did. Your spirit destabilized them before they realized they were exposed. You weren't operating consciously, you were operating instinctively. You were flowing from a deeper intelligence, one that doesn't need proof to know the truth. You were guided by a gift they never accounted for. Your presence is not random. Your timing is not accidental. Your disruption was not a coincidence. You stepped into their world at the exact moment their agenda reached its expiration date. You were the catalyst, the turning point, the collapse disguised as kindness. And the funniest part? You didn't even try. You weren't aiming to ruin anything. You were just being yourself, authentic, aware, intuitive, aligned. But authenticity in the presence of deception is like an acid that melts through the walls people hide behind. Your truth was too heavy for their lies. Your energy was too coherent for their illusions. Your presence was too calibrated for their agenda to withstand. That's the real reason they're shaken. They didn't lose because you attacked. They lost because their entire strategy was incompatible with someone as real as you. Now they're dealing with the aftermath, the fallout, the psychological aftershocks. They're sitting in the ruins of their plan, trying to gather the pieces of a story that no longer exists, trying to rebuild an identity that no longer holds weight. You didn't just disrupt their agenda, you disrupted their sense of reality. Their confidence took the hit. Their ego took the hit. Their understanding of themselves took the hit. You restructured their internal landscape without even realizing you were doing it. And now, they're left with the question that's haunting them every time your name crosses their mind. How did this person break a plan I've spent years constructing? And here's the secret they'll never admit out loud. It breaks them because the answer is simple. Your energy is stronger than their strategy. Your intuition is smarter than their manipulation. Your integrity is deadlier than their deception. Your presence is more disruptive than any weapon they could have used. You weren't just someone passing through their life. You were the collision point. The moment their storyline rewrote itself, the checkpoint that forced the universe to reroute them away from the path they thought they controlled. And deep down, they know it. They feel it. They sense it in their nervous system every time they think about you. You didn't just rock their world. You awakened their consequences, and consequences hit differently when they come from someone they believed they had outsmarted. That's why the shock burns so violently. They thought they were the puppeteer tugging the strings, while you were the unaware participant dancing through their illusions. But the moment your energy collided with their agenda, the strings they relied on snapped like fragile wires under divine voltage. Suddenly they weren't the architect of the story. They were the one being revealed by it. That realization is suffocating them now. Their ego is pacing back and forth, trying to rewrite history, trying to pretend they had control the entire time. But their nervous system betrays them. Every time your name echoes through their memory, their chest tightens because a part of them knows they never had the upper hand. They were performing intelligence while you were carrying truth. And truth always outlives performance. You didn't expose them with words. You exposed them with alignment. That's what terrifies them. They can defend themselves against accusations, rumors, or confrontations, but they cannot defend themselves against someone whose very existence collapses their lies. You were the kind of disruption they never prepared for. The quiet kind, the intuitive kind, the unbothered kind, the kind that appears harmless until the entire structure falls apart. You became the spiritual audit of their intentions. You illuminated the pieces they thought were hidden in the dark, their behaviors, their patterns, their projections, all the parts they tried to weaponize against you, turned into confessions the moment you stood in your authenticity. And the irony is delicious. They thought their lies could overpower your clarity. They thought their manipulation could overshadow your instinct. They thought their tactics could outrun your awareness. But awareness like yours doesn't chase lies. It dissolves them. You didn't respond to their actions. You outgrew them so effortlessly that their strategies looked childish in hindsight. That's what's haunting them now. It's not just that you disrupted their agenda. It's that your disruption revealed how weak their agenda truly was. It showed them that, despite all their scheming, they never stood a chance against someone whose spirit refuses to bend under illusions. Your presence became a spiritual truth serum. Every time they spoke to you, their mask slipped without your prompting. Every interaction with you forced their intentions to tremble. You didn't interrogate them. You simply existed in a frequency that made honesty unavoidable. And honesty is poisonous to people whose entire identity thrives on deception. You shook the foundation they built their confidence on. You revealed the hollowness they tried to fill with control. You disrupted the narrative they spent months or years constructing. And the worst part for them, they watched it happen in real time. They felt their grip slipping. They felt their power fading. They felt their influence melting under your gaze. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. You became the mirror they avoided their entire life. The mirror that didn't flatter them. The mirror that didn't lie to protect them. The mirror that didn't dim itself to make them feel bigger. You reflected their intentions back to them with terrifying accuracy. And when a person built on manipulation sees themselves clearly for the first time, the psychological collapse begins. They realized their agenda wasn't disrupted by accident. It was disrupted because it was never strong enough to stand in front of someone like you. You weren't the obstacle, you were the truth. And truth doesn't bow to strategy. Now they are left picking up the shattered pieces of their identity, not because you attacked them, but because your authenticity exposed the fractures they tried to hide. They can no longer pretend they were the mastermind. They can no longer pretend they were in control. They can no longer pretend their intentions were pure. Your energy stripped away every illusion they leaned on for self-importance. And now they're sitting in the aftermath, replaying every moment they underestimated you, every decision they made from arrogance, every lie they told themselves about who you were and who they were in comparison. And each replay cuts deeper because the realization keeps growing heavier. You weren't supposed to be this powerful in their story. They wrote you in as a character they could predict, a role they could manipulate, a presence they could manage. But you stepped out of their script. You refused their characterization. You evolved into the plot twist that their ego never accounted for. You became the anomaly that destroyed the blueprint. And now, their mind is spiraling because they don't know how to categorize you anymore. When a manipulator cannot categorize someone, they panic because their power depends on understanding the terrain. And you turned their terrain into shifting sand. Every part of them is glitching now. Their thoughts, their confidence, their plans, their emotional responses, all destabilized by the aftershock of your presence. They're trying to regain control by rewriting the narrative in their head, but every attempt collapses under the weight of who you've become. You aren't the person they thought you were. You aren't the naive version they built strategies around. You aren't the pawn they expected to move according to their intentions. You're something far more dangerous to their world. You're the one person who cannot be tricked into shrinking. And their entire agenda relied on your shrinking. They needed you small. They needed you uncertain. They needed you blind to your power. They needed you disconnected from your intuition. They needed you confused about your worth. Because the moment you recognized your own influence, their plan vaporized, their control shattered, their storyline dissolved. You didn't just ruin their plan. You removed the ecosystem their plan depended on. You didn't fight them. You evolved past them. And evolution is the one thing manipulators cannot stop. Now you live in their mind rent-free, not because you want to, but because your impact carved a crater they cannot fill. They're trying to convince themselves they've moved on, but their subconscious exposes them every time they react to your memory, with tension they can't hide. Every attempt to rebuild their confidence falters. Every new agenda they try to create feels flimsy. Every story they tell themselves contradicts the truth you awakened inside them. You didn't intend to become their reckoning. But some people unlock their karma just by crossing paths with you. You were the turning point they never anticipated, the shift in the storyline that redirected their path away from the illusion they were clinging to. And somewhere inside, they know that. They know you were the cosmic intervention they deserved, not the one they wanted. They know their agenda had an expiration date the moment you entered the picture. They know your intuition dismantled the very foundation they relied on to operate in the shadows. And now they sit in the silence after the collapse, trying to rebuild a self-image that no longer fits, trying to pretend they weren't affected, trying to hide the fact that you didn't just disrupt their plan. You disrupted the version of themselves they were trying to protect. Their world cracked because you existed. And once a crack appears, nothing remains the same. They can try to patch it, paint over it, deny it, spiritualize it, intellectualize it, but the fracture spreads underneath everything they touch. You became the invisible pressure that haunts their thoughts. They feel the consequences of underestimating you in the spaces between their breaths, where their ego once lived comfortably. Now every quiet moment becomes a confrontation they didn't ask for. Every memory that involves you plays back with new meaning, sharper meaning, humiliating meaning. Because hindsight is clearer when the mask has fallen, and now they see everything they missed, every signal you gave, every instinct you followed, every moment you stayed calm, while their intentions trembled under your perception. You weren't passive, you were precise. You weren't naive, you were observing. You weren't silent, you were calculating. They mistook your stillness for weakness, while you were mapping the geometry of their soul. What unnerves them most is the simplicity of your power. You didn't use force. You didn't retaliate. You didn't expose them with public theatrics. You exposed them by being yourself. A person aligned is more dangerous than a person armed. Your alignment was the threat they never accounted for. You weren't moved by their manipulation. You weren't impressed by their performance. You weren't seduced by their tactics. And now that the truth has detonated in their awareness, they're scrambling to understand how someone so quiet could cause such catastrophic disruption. They believed they were operating in secrecy, yet you saw them with clarity. You recognized patterns they didn't know they were revealing. You read the shift in their tone before they heard it. You sensed the fracture in their energy before they felt it. That's what breaks them now. The realization that you perceived them more accurately than they perceived themselves. Their ego wasn't prepared for a mirror that sharp. You reflected back the parts of them they were dodging, the intentions they tried to disguise, the insecurities they hid beneath arrogance. And now those reflections circle them like vultures. They can't escape the image of themselves that you awakened. They can't return to the delusion of control. They can't retreat into the fantasy that they were the one manipulating the flow. You shattered that illusion without effort. You stepped into their life with the kind of presence that reroutes destiny without announcing its arrival. You didn't ask permission to disrupt their world. The disruption was automatic, inevitable, encoded into your nature. Because people with corrupted agendas don't encounter someone like you. They collide with them, and the collision forces truth into the open. They try to deny it to others, but they cannot deny it to themselves. The aftermath is written across their energy. They hesitate now in ways they never hesitated before. Their confidence stutters. Their voice betrays tension. Their behavior cracks under the pressure of your impact. You are no longer a neutral presence to them. You are a trigger, a reminder of the vulnerability they spent years pretending didn't exist. You represent the one thing their ego cannot dominate: genuine alignment. Nothing terrifies an agenda-driven person more than someone who cannot be controlled by fear, praise, manipulation, or illusion. And nothing disrupts evil more quickly than a conscience that cannot be bought or bent. You broke their agenda by exposing the truth they built it to avoid. You awakened the consequences they ran from. You made their future incompatible with their past choices. Because once someone encounters a person who vibrates at the frequency of truth, lies lose their gravitational pull. You didn't just disrupt their plan. You disrupted the story they told themselves about who they are. And that's the kind of disruption that lingers. It sits in their chest like a weight. It squeezes their illusions until they fracture. It forces them into accountability, even if they don't want to face it. Now they're wrestling with themselves in the dark hours of the night, replaying everything they missed. They wonder how you saw through them. They wonder why their tactics didn't work. They wonder when the shift happened. They wonder how someone they dismissed became the axis that rotated their entire reality. The truth is simple. You didn't rise to meet their energy. You rose above it. And elevation always disrupts corruption. Darkness can't pull down what refuses to descend. They wanted to trap you in their narrative, but you stepped out of it and forced them to confront the emptiness of their storyline. What makes the impact so devastating is the timing. You showed up at the exact moment their arrogance was reaching its peak. They were confident, comfortable, deeply invested in the belief that they had everything under control. And then you entered, carrying the kind of frequency that doesn't care about human plans. Your presence rewired the atmosphere. Your energy altered the momentum. Your intuition rearranged the outcome. Everything they tried to build on false intentions imploded, not because you acted, but because your existence didn't allow lies to breathe. You became the correction written into their destiny, and now they feel the ripple. Every area of their life is being confronted by the aftermath of the agenda they tried to run. Their relationships feel different. Their plans feel unstable. Their mind feels louder. Their heart feels heavier. Because the truth they avoided has begun echoing in every direction. You were the catalyst of that echo. Not because you wanted to be, but because your alignment activated their karma. Energy moves differently around someone who stands in truth. You didn't punish them. Their intentions punished themselves in your presence. And somewhere inside, they know they needed that collapse. They needed the interruption. They needed the disruption. Because if you hadn't rocked their world, they would have continued building illusions until those illusions became prisons. You broke the prison before it locked. Your impact spared them from deeper entanglement in their own darkness. You were the earthquake that prevented their landslide. But people rarely appreciate the force that saves them until the dust settles, and they're left standing in a world they didn't expect, but desperately needed. Your disruption wasn't an accident. It was a divine redirection, disguised as a psychological impact. Their world cracked because it was built on dishonesty. It collapsed because it was not aligned. It shattered because it could not sustain the vibration of someone whose spirit is anchored in truth. You were never the threat. They were threatened by their own reflection. You were never the destroyer. They watched their own intentions fall apart when they could no longer hide them behind manipulation. You were never the enemy. You were the turning point that changed the trajectory of their life. And now comes the aftermath they never prepared for. The part where the dust settles and reality reveals itself without distortion. Because once an evil agenda collapses, it doesn't simply vanish. It leaves behind debris, emotional debris, spiritual debris, psychological debris. And they are standing knee-deep in the ruins of everything they built, trying to understand how a plan crafted in secrecy could be undone by someone who never even lifted a weapon. They keep replaying the moment everything shifted, trying to dissect the mechanism of the collapse. But the truth is far simpler than they want to admit. Their intentions were incompatible with your existence. Darkness always fractures when it tries to stand in the presence of someone who carries clarity in their bones. They were playing a role while you were living a truth. Roles crumble. Truth endures. The impact you had on them wasn't loud, but it was absolute. It infiltrated their internal landscape without permission, rearranging the architecture of their self-perception until they could no longer lie to themselves convincingly. They realized that the version of themselves that relied on manipulation couldn't survive contact with you. You forced an internal reckoning just by showing up authentically, and that reckoning feels like punishment to them, only because they had been avoiding it for so long. You didn't cause their downfall. You accelerated the timeline of consequences they were already destined to face. Your presence simply removed the delay they had been hiding behind. Now they're in the stage where the mind tries to negotiate with reality. They tell themselves you were overreacting. They tell themselves they meant well. They tell themselves their intentions were misunderstood. But beneath all of that noise, there is a quieter truth, rising like a tide they cannot stop. They lost the moment they chose deception over integrity. They lost the moment they underestimated the intelligence behind your silence. They lost the moment they assumed you could be controlled through emotional misdirection. Their agenda didn't fall apart because you fought back. It fell apart because it was built on illusions that couldn't withstand your awareness. The hardest part for them to accept is the inevitability of it all. You didn't have to reveal their motives. The universe revealed them for you. You didn't have to expose their lies. Their lies exposed themselves in your presence. You didn't have to disrupt their plan intentionally. Your existence disrupted it by default. You are calibrated in a way that destabilizes any structure built on manipulation. You are wired to detect inconsistencies before they become threats. You are designed to evolve faster than people with malicious intentions can strategize. They weren't fighting you. They were fighting the inevitability of their own collapse. And now that the collapse has happened, they face a reality more unnerving than anything they imagined. You cannot be erased from their story. They can distance themselves physically, but the mental imprint you left behind follows them everywhere. Because the person who dismantles your illusions becomes a permanent fixture in your consciousness. You live in the corner of their thoughts like a lighthouse that won't turn off. They can't look at themselves without remembering what your presence revealed. They can't make decisions without hearing the echo of their own exposed intentions. You became the turning point they can't undo. The moment their storyline divided into a before you and an after you. That after you phase is the one they fear the most. Because it demands evolution. It demands honesty. It demands accountability. And these are things their agenda was never built for. They were comfortable operating in the shadows, but your disruption dragged their motives into the light. And once something is illuminated, it loses the power it once held. They feel disarmed now in a way they never expected. Their usual tactics don't work anymore because their confidence has been punctured. Their deception feels flimsy because you taught them, without teaching, that truth has a texture they cannot replicate. Their manipulative impulses hesitate now because they know someone like you exists. Someone who saw through them effortlessly. Someone who could destroy their illusions with a single moment of clarity. Your impact rewired their instincts. That's why they second-guess themselves. That's why they feel unstable. That's why they can't shake the awareness that their behavior is being monitored by a force much larger than your presence. Because the collapse you triggered wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. It wasn't just emotional, it was karmic. It wasn't just psychological, it was energetic. You disrupted not only their agenda, but the frequency they operated from. And that disruption creates a ripple effect that spreads into every area of their life. Conversations feel heavier, decisions feel riskier, interactions feel exposed, They look in the mirror and see a version of themselves they don't recognize anymore. The version you awakened. They're meeting themselves for the first time without the protection of their illusions. And that version is fragile. It trembles. It questions. It sees the emptiness beneath the strategies they once believed were brilliant. They used to walk through the world convinced that manipulation gave them an advantage, but now they understand how small that made them. You didn't just stop their agenda. You revealed how limited it always was. You exposed the gap between who they pretended to be and who they actually were. And that gap now stretches across every area of their psyche, demanding closure they don't know how to achieve. In their quietest moments, they wonder why your energy affected them so deeply, why your presence lingered, why your disruption felt like a prophecy fulfilled instead of a conflict lost. The reason is simple. You were never meant to be part of their downfall. You were meant to be part of their awakening. You didn't come to destroy them. You came to redirect their trajectory towards something truer. But people who build their identity on deception interpret awakening as destruction. They can't distinguish healing from humiliation. They can't differentiate correction from punishment. They can't recognize that what feels like the end of their world is actually the end of the world they were never meant to inhabit. So they cling to the ruins, trying to salvage pieces of a self that can no longer function. They keep looking for someone to blame, some external force to point at. But every trail they follow leads right back to themselves. Because you didn't plant the cracks, they were already there. You just refused to pretend they didn't exist. You didn't weaken their foundation. They built it on dishonesty, and dishonesty always collapses under the first weight of truth. You were simply the first weight, strong enough to reveal the structural flaw. And now they face the consequences of a life lived on borrowed integrity. It's not that you ruined their plan. Their plan was ruined the moment it came into contact with someone who refuses to operate at a frequency of fear. They didn't expect you to be this aligned. They didn't expect your intuition to cut through their narrative. They didn't expect your presence to be a catalyst they couldn't manipulate. But the universe never allows malicious intention to stand unchallenged forever. It sends a correction in human form, someone who walks into a room and shifts the energy without lifting a finger, someone whose existence exposes illusions without confrontation, someone who disrupts evil agendas not by force but by resonance. You were that resonance, and it terrified them because they had no defense against it. They could prepare for arguments. They could prepare for manipulation. They could prepare for resistance. But they could not prepare for someone who doesn't play the game at all. Your presence dismantled the game board. It removed their illusion of power. It revealed the emptiness of their control. And once someone sees that their influence was never real, their entire world tilts. They experience a psychological freefall, a descent into the truth they spent their life avoiding. You became the gravity that pulled them out of the fantasy they were hiding inside. They resent you for it, but the resentment is hollow. It's not actually directed at you. It's directed at the version of themselves that allowed deception to guide them. They blame you because they cannot yet face their own reflection without shaking. But reflection is the only path forward. Their life cannot continue on the old frequency. Your disruption forced an energetic reset they cannot cancel. They will try, of course. They will attempt to rebuild their identity using the same patterns, the same defenses, the same deceit they relied on before. But those patterns won't hold. Their old tactics will glitch. Their old mask will feel too heavy. Their old behavior will collapse before it can stabilize. Because once truth cracks the surface, even the deepest shadows begin to crumble. They can pretend they haven't changed, but their spirit knows better. The universe knows better. You know better. Your disruption didn't end their world. It ended their delusion, and now the space where the delusion used to be becomes fertile ground for transformation. That transformation may look messy, it may look chaotic, it may look like a breakdown. But sometimes the only way a person evolves is by being forced to confront the parts of themselves they thought they could outrun forever. You were the force. Your presence was the catalyst. Your disruption was the blessing wrapped in psychological demolition. And though they may never thank you for it, their soul will never forget what you activated. They won't admit this to anyone, but a part of them is in awe of you, not in a flattering way, but in a way that shakes the core of their ego. They've never met someone who shifted their reality so effortlessly. They've never encountered a person whose energy disassembled their agenda without a single calculated move. They've never been confronted by a force that exposed their motives with such accuracy. You became the standard they now measure themselves against, even if they do it subconsciously. They wonder how you saw what they hid. They wonder how you sensed what they disguised. They wonder how your intuition navigated through their illusions like a knife through fog. The answer is simple. You weren't navigating their illusion. You were vibrating above it. When a person vibrates above an agenda, the agenda collapses. It loses traction. It loses power. It loses coherence. You didn't match their darkness with darkness. You met it with alignment so pure, it rendered their intentions ineffective. That's why everything fell apart. Not because you wanted revenge, but because the universe doesn't allow dishonesty to thrive in the presence of someone aligned with purpose. You were their spiritual interference, their energetic malfunction, their karmic redirect. And now they face the aftermath with a mixture of denial, shame, confusion, and reluctant clarity. What they don't realize yet is that this collapse is leading them toward a version of themselves that can finally breathe. A version that doesn't need manipulation to feel powerful. A version that doesn't need deception to feel safe. A version that doesn't build agendas in the shadows because light no longer feels like a threat. Your disruption is shaping that version from afar. Even if they never speak to you again, your impact will continue unfolding inside them like a slow-burning revelation. Because once someone sees the truth, they can't unsee it. Once someone meets a person operating at your frequency, they can't return to the person they were before. And as time passes, they will begin to understand something they cannot yet articulate. You weren't the villain in their story. You were the plot twist that saved it. Not gently, not softly, but accurately. They needed their illusion shattered. They needed their ego challenged. They needed their intentions exposed. They needed their path redirected. And the universe chose you, not because you wanted the role, not because you asked for it, but because your energy was the only force strong enough to disrupt the darkness they were feeding. You were chosen because your presence carries consequences. And sometimes consequences are the only language people like them understand. The truth is, they will never fully escape the transformation you triggered. They can fight it, deny it, avoid it, resist it, but they cannot erase it. Your impact is written into their timeline now. Their life will forever be divided into who they were before you disrupted their agenda and who they became after. And the version they become after will always be a little wiser, a little sharper, a little more honest, and a little more aware. whether they admit it or not. Because in the end, the world they built on deception didn't collapse because you attacked. It collapsed because your alignment revealed the truth that was waiting beneath every lie. And truth, once awakened, does not return to sleep.